At 2:14 local time, 3 provinces go dark at once, and nobody in Moscow's air defense network yet understands why. Not one missile, not one drone, 340 separate objects, lifting off from a dozen different launch points across Ukraine within the same 11 minutes, all converging on the same stretch of Russian territory from 6 different bearings. This is not a raid, this is a flood, and the dam was never built for this much water. If you look at what's actually in that swarm, it's a mongrel fleet. Liuti drones, propeller-driven, cheap, slow, built to loiter for 1,000 kilometers on a lawnmower engine, and a GPS unit that costs less than a laptop. Bars Alpha cruise drones tucked in behind them, faster, jet-powered, carrying a real warhead instead of just a camera. And laced through the middle of it all, 4 Neptune cruise missiles, the naval killer Ukraine turned into a land attack weapon, each one worth more than the 11 drones flying escort around it combined. None of that matters yet to the men in the radar bunkers. Right now, all they have is noise. Too much noise. A Russian air defense controller, 300 kilometers from the border, watches his scope fill with returns the way a windshield fills with bugs on a summer highway. He's trained to find the one thing that matters inside 100 things that don't. Tonight, the ratio has flipped. There are more things that matter than his radar has interceptors to spend. That's the whole design behind this attack. Not stealth, not speed, arithmetic. Every strike Ukraine has launched over the past 3 years taught it something about how Russia's air defense actually thinks. Not how it's supposed to think on paper, but how a tired crew behaves at 2 in the morning when the scope won't stop filling up. Planners in Kyiv have spent months studying exactly which battery sits where, which radar operators tend to hesitate, and which stretch of border gets the least attention because nothing important has ever flown through it before. Tonight's route was never improvised. It was built off 18 months of watching how the other side reacts under pressure, and then giving that side more pressure than it has ever had to handle in one night. Every Russian air defense complex, from the S-400 battery guarding a refinery to the Pantsir truck parked outside an ammo depot, runs on a budget. A finite number of missiles in the ready racks, a finite number of seconds a crew has to identify, classify, and decide before a target is past them. Flood that decision cycle with 300 objects instead of 3, and even a perfect system starts making mistakes, because a perfect system built for 3 targets was never built for 300. The lead wave crosses the border first, and it's the cheapest thing in the whole package. Foam and plywood decoys shaped to throw back the exact radar signature of a real strike drone, built for a fraction of what a jamming pod costs, flying in loose formation like a flock of birds that forgot how to fly straight. A Buk M3 crew 40 kilometers inside Russian territory locks one, tracks it for 6 seconds, and fires. $200,000 of interceptor detonates against a machine built from a lawnmower engine and a sheet of styrofoam. Somewhere back in Kyiv, someone is smiling at that trade. The Buk crew doesn't know they missed the point. They hit their target. That's exactly the problem. Every decoy that dies is doing its job. Because every second a battery spends killing a fake is a second it isn't tracking something real. And every real missile spent on a fake is one less real missile in the rack when the actual strike package arrives 20 minutes later. Behind the decoys, in the gap they've bought, the real attack starts flying low. 50 meters off the deck, following river valleys and tree lines the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape, the Liuti drones grind east at 180 kilometers an hour. That's slow. Slow enough that a fighter jet can barely keep its nose pointed at one without stalling. But slow is the whole point, because slow means quiet. And quiet means a radar operator has to work twice as hard to pull that faint, flickering return out of the ground clutter stacked up underneath it. A ground radar bends its beam out along the curve of the Earth and loses anything hugging the deck past a certain range. The same trick that let the flamingos slip past Russian air defense last time. 50 meters of altitude tucked behind the bulge of the planet is 50 meters of invisibility. Free, no jamming required, just geometry doing what geometry always does. An S-400 can reach out 400 kilometers against something flying high. Against something flying in the weeds, that same battery is blind past 30. So Russia builds its defense in layers instead. Long-range batteries out front, short-range gun missile trucks tucked in close, radar planes overhead to fill the gap the ground radars can't cover. On paper, it's a wall. Tonight, it's a wall with 300 separate people trying to climb over it at the same time, and a wall can only stop the climbers it can actually see. 90 kilometers in, the first Neptune missile clips the edge of an S-300 battery's engagement envelope, and for once, the radar holds a lock long enough to fire. The interceptor screams off its rail, a plume of exhaust lighting up a sleeping town for 3 seconds, and dives toward a target still holding 50 meters and dead level. The proximity fuse listens for something the size of a fighter jet crossing open sky. It hears the ground 18 meters below the missile instead, can't tell one return from the other, and detonates early into empty air. A wall of steel fragments blooms over a patch of nothing. The Neptune flies on, untouched, unaware it was ever threatened. That same battery gets one more shot at a second target 12 kilometers up the belt, and this time it isn't geometry that saves the drone. It's a decision made hours earlier on a laptop in Ukraine. The Bars Alpha assigned to this route was given a heading that runs almost perfectly sideways across the battery's radar beam instead of straight at it. A tracking radar hunts closing speed. Anything rushing toward it lights up bright. Anything crossing its beam instead reads as nearly motionless. And a radar built to punch holes in the sky writes off anything reading as motionless as ground clutter and throws it away. For 4 seconds, the fastest thing in that stretch of sky reads slower than the truck it's flying past. 4 seconds is enough. The lock breaks, the battery reacquires the wrong return, and the drone is gone before anyone realizes what just slid past them. None of this is cleverness on the missile's part. A drone can't outthink anyone. Somebody drew that dogleg on a map the night before, looked at where the batteries sat, and bent the route around them the same way you'd route a road around a mountain instead of through it. 90 minutes in, the picture starts to change, and it changes because Russia's last set of eyes finally gets a look at the whole board. 10 kilometers over the Volga Basin, an A-50U radar plane sweeps its rotating dome across a stretch of dark countryside and paints returns that no ground radar for 300 kilometers can see. From up there is no curve of the Earth to hide behind. No ridgeline, no valley, no bulge of the planet standing between the dome and the machines skimming the terrain below it. Every drone and missile that spent the last 2 hours hugging the ground for cover suddenly has nowhere left to hide, because the thing hunting it isn't down on the ground anymore. The controller aboard that aircraft doesn't reach for his own weapons. He reaches for a radio. 2 MiG-31 interceptors sitting on strip alert since midnight get vectored onto a stream of tracks, flying entirely on the A-50's numbers, radars switched off, invisible to anything that might carry a warning receiver. Not one of these drones carries that kind of receiver. None of them know an interceptor exists until the missile that kills them is already inside 2 kilometers. The MiGs don't chase from behind because nothing this slow needs chasing. They swing wide, cut the corner, and turn back in until the target is running almost straight down the nose of the jet, the exact geometry that turns a nearly invisible crossing shot into a clean head-on lock. An R-37 missile drops away, lights its motor, and closes the gap at better than 5 times the speed of sound before the drone below it even understands the sky above it has changed. First hit. A flash on the deck, and one Liuti simply stops existing mid-flight. The jet banks, resets, and the controller starts walking it onto the next track. Over the next 20 minutes, those 2 interceptors work through 9 of the slower, lower drones, one clean shot after another, because against something with no warning receiver and no maneuver logic beyond flying the line it was given, an A-50 and a MiG-31 team is close to unbeatable. 9 kills should sound like a disaster for the attacking side. It isn't, and the reason is the same arithmetic that opened this whole night. 2 interceptors, 1 radar plane, 1 missile fired at a time. Meanwhile, 230 other objects are still inbound, spread across a front nearly 400 kilometers wide, and a fighter burning fuel on one flank can't be over the other flank 15 minutes later. While the MiGs work the drones they can physically reach, the Neptune missiles and the fastest of the Bars Alpha drones slip through a stretch of sky nobody can swing an interceptor into in time, running for the deep interior on courses drawn to be low and boring, not clever. 140 kilometers from the first real target, the surviving package crosses into the thickest jamming belt on the whole route, and every GPS receiver still flying starts hearing the same counterfeit signal at once. This is spoofing, not brute force jamming. A GPS signal falls 20,000 kilometers to reach a receiver on the ground, and arrives quieter than the background static around it, a whisper a receiver only hears because it knows exactly what tune to listen for. The jamming trucks parked across this stretch of Russia don't try to shout over that whisper. They fake it, broadcasting a stronger, cleaner counterfeit and gently dragging every unprotected receiver's idea of its own position off to one side. It works beautifully on the drones that don't carry anything better than a single antenna. 6 of the remaining Bars Alpha units drift off their intended track by degrees that grow into kilometers, and 3 of them end up burning the last of their fuel over farmland that was never the target, crashing into fields with nothing valuable within a kilometer of the wreckage. That's not failure by design. That's the cost of building the cheap half of the swarm cheap. Ukraine never expected every drone to reach the target. It expected enough of them to. The Neptune missiles and the 2 remaining Bars Alphas carrying multi-antenna receivers shrugged the spoofing off entirely. A ring of small antennas wired to a single processor that can steer a null directly onto a jamming source, the way a man at a loud party plugs one ear toward the loudest voice in the room, while keeping the rest open for the conversation that actually matters. The jamming trucks scream into a wall of silence on that bearing, and the real satellite fix comes through clean on every other. Down in the truck, the crew watches its perfect counterfeit signal change absolutely nothing about the tracks still crossing their screen. The missiles never once looked away from where they were actually going. 40 kilometers out, the last layer of the defense finally gets a look at what's left, and what's left is the hardest part of the whole package. A Pantsir battery guarding the approach to a fuel depot snaps a radar lock onto the lead Neptune and swings its twin cannons onto the bearing. 3 seconds from a firing solution, the missile's course bends across the radar beam instead of into it, the same crossing target trick that beat the S-300 further back, and the lock breaks clean. The barrels drift off target, hunting nothing. The missile that was supposedly caught keeps flying. A second Pantsir, a few kilometers down the perimeter, gets a better geometry and actually manages a shot at one of the surviving Bars Alphas, catching it almost head-on where the crossing trick doesn't apply. The drone comes apart 4 kilometers short of the fence line, debris scattering across an open field. 1 down. It's the only clean intercept the entire inner ring manages all night, and it happens because for once the target flew straight at the gun instead of past it. Everything else keeps coming. The fuel depot's perimeter has 1 more line of defense, a Tor M2 short-range system parked inside the wire specifically for the threat that gets this close, and it earns its keep in the last 30 seconds, knocking down 1 Liuti drone that strays too close to the wrong storage tank on its final approach, the interceptor catching it 100 meters short of the fence and scattering burning wreckage across the tree line outside the perimeter. That's the last save Russia gets tonight. The lead Neptune comes in flat and level at 400 knots, clears the perimeter fence with meters to spare, and drives straight into the side of the largest storage tank on the site before the world above it even finishes registering the shape crossing the wire. The warhead doesn't need finesse against a target this soft. 600 kilograms of high explosive detonates inside a tank holding tens of thousands of tons of refined fuel, and the fireball that follows doesn't look like an explosion so much as a second sunrise breaking 8 hours early over the wrong horizon. 90 seconds later, the second surviving Bars Alpha threads the gap between 2 burning tanks and puts its own smaller warhead into the pump station feeding the entire complex, the one piece of infrastructure that turns a fire in one tank into a fire that spreads through every pipe connecting it to the rest of the depot. That single hit does more damage to the site's ability to function than either of the 2 remaining decoy drones manage crashing harmlessly into open ground nearby, still chasing a spoofed position fix that was never real to begin with. By the time the smoke column is visible from towns 40 kilometers away, the math for the night is already settled. 340 objects launched, roughly 200 decoys and drones intercepted, jammed off course, or simply lost to malfunction along the way. Exactly the outcome the decoy-heavy design of the package expected and accepted. And 6 real weapons, 4 Neptune missiles, and 2 hardened Bars Alpha drones, reaching the target intact, which was never going to take 300 hits to burn. It only ever needed to take the 6 that mattered, hidden inside 234 that didn't. That's the arithmetic Russia's layered air defense was never built to solve. Every battery on that route did roughly what it was designed to do. The Buk crew killed a decoy clean. The S-300 crew got fooled by a proximity fuse that couldn't tell a low target from the dirt beneath it. The MiG-31 team ran up 9 confirmed kills against the slowest, most exposed part of the swarm. The Pantsir crews split the difference. 1 clean kill, 1 lock broken by geometry alone. Every single one of those systems performed, none of them lost. And Russia still woke up to a fuel depot burning, because a wall built to stop 300 separate threats one at a time was never going to survive 300 threats arriving at once, spread across every kind of blind spot a layered defense carries, all being exploited in the same 11 minutes by design. While every one of those 400 kilometers of sky is being fought over in real time, a second front nobody in the air defense chain is even watching opens up 200 kilometers south, out on open water, and it's the one piece of this attack that was never meant to touch a radar screen at all. 4 Sea Baby unmanned surface drones, low, flat, barely taller than the waves they're riding through, have been running dark since well before midnight, engines throttled back to a crawl that keeps their wake from throwing up the kind of white water a patrol aircraft might notice from altitude. Each one is carrying close to 1,000 kilograms of explosive packed into a hull that rides low enough in the water to read, on the rare radar that even bothers scanning that stretch of sea, as a fishing boat that wandered somewhere it shouldn't have. That's deliberate. Russian naval defense around this stretch of coast was built to watch the sky, because for the first 2 years of this war, the sky was where everything came from. Nobody built a wall of point defense guns facing the water side of a tanker terminal, because nobody thought they needed one. A surface drone doesn't have to outfly an S-400. It just has to swim past the assumption that the threat only ever comes from above. A patrol boat crew spots one of the 4 with a searchlight at 400 meters, opens up with a heavy machine gun, and manages to put enough rounds into the hole to slow it, not stop it. The drone keeps closing on a wounded engine, trailing fuel, and detonates 20 meters short of the hole it was aimed at, close enough that the shock wave still buckles plating along the waterline. A partial win for the patrol crew. A near miss that still does damage, which is its own kind of failure for the side doing the defending. The other 3 never get spotted at all. They thread between 2 moored tankers at idle speed, close enough that a sailor on deck could have thrown a rock and hit one, and detonate against the hull of a support vessel loading fuel for the very depot burning 140 kilometers inland. The blast tears the ship open below the waterline and starts a fire that spreads to the dock structure itself. And now, the same night that opened with 340 objects in the air, closes with a second column of smoke rising off open water from a threat that never once showed up as anything worth shooting at until it was already too close to matter. That's the real shape of what biggest means in an attack like this one. It was never really about the number of missiles or the size of any single warhead. It was about forcing one country to defend everything, everywhere, in the same 11 minutes, land and sea and air all at once, with a defense network built one layer at a time over decades to handle one kind of threat arriving from one kind of direction. Split that attention 4 ways simultaneously, and even the systems that work exactly as designed start working for a country that's already lost the initiative before the first missile crosses the border. Moscow will rebuild the tanks. Storage capacity can be poured in concrete and welded in steel inside a year. What's harder to rebuild is the assumption that started the night. The idea that enough radars, enough interceptors, and enough layers stacked one behind another adds up to a wall nothing gets through. Tonight, something got through. Not because any single system failed, but because the attack was never aimed at any single system. It was aimed at all of them, at the same time, and asked a question Russian air defense doctrine has never had to answer honestly until now. What happens when there isn't enough time, enough missiles, or enough radar operators to matter which threat is real, before the real ones are already burning on the ground behind you? Somewhere in Ukraine tonight, someone is already counting how many of those 200 decoys need to fly again next time, and how few of the real 6 actually have to land. If you enjoyed this video, then watch the one where Russia's last radar plane over the Black Sea finally went down for good.